All right. Good morning, everybody, and happy Friday. Thank you for taking some time to join us this morning on our webinar series. I think we've got a really timely topic here. I know it's something I was just sharing that I've been a part of a couple of conversations this week already. I think most of you know me by now, but I am Ann Smith-Tate. I'm the president and CEO of the Chamber, and so happy to have you all join us today. Before we jump into our presenter, I do want to give a shout out to our Investor Guild sponsors this year for 2021, our 75th year. Our Platinum Investors Guild is Advent Health, American Family Insurance, the agencies of Brian Rapp, Brad Henry, Williams and Associates, Michelle Herford and Associates, Kyle Zeller and Michelle Underwood, the Central Bank of the Midwest, the City of Shawnee, Elanco, Waste Management, and of course, Amos Family Funeral Home, Complete Construction Service, Country Club Bank, Evergy, GBA, Overland Park Regional Medical Center, Shawnee Mission Ford, and the Zardo Rickey Development Corporation. Really, truly thank you to all of those who invest in our chamber. We just simply cannot do the work that we do without your consistent investment. So appreciate that. And now I'd like to introduce Tammy Somogye. Tammy is with Lathrop GPM, and she concentrates her practice on education and employment law, representing educational institutions, municipalities, and businesses. She also develops employment policies for Kansas municipalities and various businesses. Tammy advises these groups regarding a broad range of employment issues that arise, such as background checks, employee discipline and terminations, the Family Medical Leave Act, unemployment compensation appeals, workers' compensation claims, wage and hour issues, discrimination, and harassment complaints. Tammy's also experienced in laws governing disabled students, and she assists Kansas school districts and colleges in investigations and complaints of all types filed with the United States Department of Education Office for Civil Rights by students and employees. Her area of emphasis allows Tammy to be a unique asset to her clients and who are facing increasing demands for special education service and disability-related accommodations. We reached out to Lathrop and asked for somebody that could help us understand the issues as it relates to HR and vaccinations and COVID and getting people back into the workplace. And we feel like Tammy's going to provide some great information for us today. We appreciate your time and your expertise, Tammy, and I will turn it over to you and let you kind of take it away. Thank you so much.
All right. I need to be able to share my screen. All right.
You should be able to now.
Thank you. All right. Oops. So I wanted to talk today about COVID vaccines in the workplace and the things that employers need to be considering as they are making decisions about the type of policy that they want to have with respect to vaccinations. The first question that employers need to be considering is, do I want to have a policy that requires mandatory vaccinations in order to be able to return to the workplace, or do I want to allow people to make that decision for themselves and have voluntary vaccinations, a voluntary vaccination policy? And so in considering the mandatory piece, the question is, can employers require folks to get vaccinated? The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC, issued some guidance in December of 2020. And unfortunately, the guidance does not answer that question precisely, but by addressing a range of issues raised by employers who adopt mandatory vaccination policies, the EEOC does strongly suggest that employers can indeed require employees to be vaccinated. Now, we have to keep in mind that the EEOC guidance is not law, but courts may defer to the agency's interpretation of the law in certain circumstances. Thus, we can consider the EEOC guidance persuasive authority, but not binding. So employers can require employees to be vaccinated, but the second question is, should employers require employees to be vaccinated before they can return to the workplace. And that involves a lot of different considerations for an employer to analyze and think about. Most large employers, you've probably noticed, have adopted an educate and encourage, or educate, encourage, and incentivize approach, not the requirement or the mandatory approach. It's likely that they've taken that approach because employers considering mandatory vaccination policies must consider a whole host of issues. The first issue is that currently the vaccines are being provided under the emergency use authorization that the FDA permits. And that it's important to understand what that is. According to the FDA, an emergency use authorization is a mechanism to facilitate the ability and use of medical countermeasures, including vaccines, during public health emergencies such as the current COVID-19 pandemic. Under an emergency use authorization, or EUA, the FDA may allow the use of unapproved medical products or unapproved uses of approved medical products in an emergency to diagnose, treat, or prevent serious or life-threatening diseases or conditions when certain statutory criteria have been met, including that there are no adequate, approved, and available alternatives. Taking into consideration input from the FDA, manufacturers decide whether and when to submit an EUA request to the FDA. Once submitted, the FDA then evaluates the EUA request and determines whether the relevant statutory criteria are met, taking into account the totality of the scientific evidence about the vaccine that is available to the FDA. Now, why does that matter? It matters because the COVID-19 vaccines are being given in the context of an EUA, and the FDA requires that those administering the vaccine inform the recipient that he or she has the option to accept or refuse the vaccine. So if an employee refuses the vaccine and ultimately is terminated because he or she is not vaccinated, the employee could file a lawsuit claiming retaliatory discharge. This type of claim would assert that public policy protects an individual's right to refuse the vaccine, and the sole reason for the termination was because he exercised that right. Of course, there are defenses to this type of claim, and the employer could argue that the adverse action was driven by the employer's duty to provide a safe workplace, not the employee's exercise of a right. Both the arguments and the defenses are untested and would be costly to test. And so that is one consideration, I think, that weighs in on the side of allowing voluntary vaccinations and not having a mandatory vaccination policy. Another thing to consider is whether the vaccine administration constitutes a medical examination that violates the Americans with Disabilities Act. As you know, the ADA generally precludes employers from requiring employees to undergo medical examinations, except in very limited circumstances. The EEOC's guidance concludes that administering a vaccine is not a medical examination under the ADA. So if you were to consider a mandatory vaccination, you would not be violating the ADA in that regard. Does a vaccine mandate requiring an employee to provide proof that the person received the vaccine constitute a disability-related inquiry that violates the ADA? You should understand that the ADA generally precludes employers from requiring employees to respond to disability-related inquiries, except in limited circumstances. The EEOC's guidance concludes that requesting proof of vaccination is not a disability-related inquiry. However, other aspects of a vaccine policy, such as inquiring why an employee did not get vaccinated, may generate ADA compliance issues. If an employer requires employees to provide proof that they have received a COVID-19 vaccine from a pharmacy or their own healthcare provider, the employer may want to warn the employee not to provide any medical information as part of the proof in order to avoid implicating the ADA. In addition, the employer may want to warn the employee not to provide generic or genetic information as part of the proof. As long as this warning is provided, any genetic information the employer receives in response to its request for proof of vaccination will be considered inadvertent and therefore not a violation of the genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And so it is important that truly when you're asking for proof of vaccination, that you simply say, I just want to know whether you've been vaccinated or not. And if you have the card that you get when you get vaccinated, that's enough. I don't need a long history. I don't need any information from your physician other than that you've been administered the vaccine. There is model language in the law that you can use if you want to warn folks about just the limited information that you want to share or that you want them to share. If an employee refuses to share whether or not he or she was vaccinated, that could be a reason for termination, but you would need to work through the facts and circumstances to evaluate the risk associated with that decision. We're kind of in uncharted territory here. And so I don't want any of my clients or any of the folks listening to this presentation to be one of the test cases or the first to advance those arguments because of the expense and just the uncertainty associated with it. So what does an employer do if an employee says that he has a disability that prevents him from getting a vaccine? This is essentially a request for an accommodation, an exemption from the vaccine mandate because of the employee's disability. You cannot automatically reject the request for any employee or immediately terminate the employee for violating a mandatory vaccine policy. Instead, you must engage in the interactive process with each and every employee who makes this request. Is the employee at issue in close contact with others? Can the employee work in an isolated workspace? Can the employee work remotely? Does the employee interact exclusively with other employees, and are those employees vaccinated? Does the employee interact with the public with no way to know whether the public is vaccinated? Would a leave of absence address the concern? Is there equipment or auxiliary aids and services that could address this specific disability? How much risk is posed to others if the employee is exempted from the vaccine requirement? The key here is that the EEOC's guidance states that employers cannot exclude employees from the workplace or take any other action unless there is no way to provide a reasonable accommodation absent undue hardship that would eliminate or reduce the risk so the unvaccinated employee does not pose a direct threat to the health or safety of others. If you're going to rely on the undue hardship piece, you need to have documented consideration of the factors involved in coming to that conclusion. You need to consider the nature and the cost of the accommodation that was requested, the overall financial resources of the facility or the employer making the reasonable accommodation, the number of persons employed, and the effect on expenses and resources of the employer. You need to consider the overall financial resources, size, number of employees, and the type and location of facilities of the employer if the facility involved in the reasonable accommodation is part of a larger facility. So say you've got 5 different locations, you need to consider the issue in connection with all 5 of your locations. The type of operation of the employer, including the structure and functions of the workplace, the geographic separateness, and administrative or fiscal relationship of the facility involved in making the accommodation to the employer, and the impact of the accommodation on the operation of the facility. So if you are going to, you cannot simply conclude, oh, it's an undue hardship without considering multiple factors and documenting the answers to those questions before you exclude someone on the basis of it being an undue hardship to provide the exception to the vaccination requirement. What does an employer do if an employee says her religion prevents her from getting a vaccine? Title VII of the Civil Rights Act covers employers or requires covered employers, those who employ 15 or more employees, to provide accommodations to employees who object to a requirement or practice based on sincerely held religious beliefs. This has received more attention recently since the Johnson & Johnson vaccine has received emergency use authorization. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is made from cloned cells derived from a fetus aborted in the late 1980s. And so some religious leaders have recently issued public statements on the use of this particular vaccine. The U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops, for example, has recommended avoiding the Johnson & Johnson vaccine if possible. By contrast, the Vatican has indicated that it is morally acceptable to take vaccines such as the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, where the research and production have involved use of fetal cell lines. The most readily available accommodation for a vaccine mandating employer in many cases might be to require the employee to receive one of the other available vaccines, which are not susceptible to the same fetal cell-based objection, assuming that this approach does not run afoul of some broader religious opposition that the employee has to vaccines. This accommodation, allowing the alternate type, would not likely impose an undue hardship on the employer, provided that alternative COVID-19 vaccines are reasonably available to the employee. However, if no alternative to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is readily available to an objecting employee, the possibility of reasonable accommodation may be more difficult, requiring the employer to consider whether other creative options might be available. In addition, if an employee holds a serious or sincerely held religious belief against any vaccine, the employer then will have to further consider whether there are any accommodations available and how it might accommodate that belief. You need to approach this request similarly to as you did with an ADA interactive process, and consider the factors. Is the person's belief sincere? Is it really related to a religion? And then what type of impact would allowing that accommodation have on your business? Another question that we often get is whether an employer can administer the vaccine themselves. Although employers can administer the vaccine themselves, such vaccination administration adds substantially to compliance duties and risks. Any vaccination-related inquiries or requirements must be job-related and consistent with business necessity. And any vaccination-related inquiries must avoid obtaining information that would violate the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. Your best bet really is, just because of the information that needs to be garnered before the vaccine is given, your best bet is to have someone else administer it. The next issue to consider is whether or not there are potential labor relations issues. The answer is yes. Even if your employees do not belong to a union, if employees coordinate resistance or work together to protest the requirement for vaccination, these actions would be protected by the National Labor Relations Act, which means that the employees may be protected from discipline due to their protests. If you're in a union setting, any mandated vaccination program would likely be a mandatory subject of bargaining with the union, unless the agreement provides management with broad rights to develop such policies on their own. There is an emergency exception to the mandatory bargaining rule, but the NLRB has rarely allowed employers to rely on this defense. So with all of those things to consider, voluntary vaccinations really are probably the way to go, and not requiring people to be vaccinated before they can return to the workplace. It's also important that employers be familiar with the updated OSHA guidance from the OSHA stands for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. In January of 2021, the OSHA issued guidance, and it does include a disclaimer indicating that OSHA recommendations are, quote, advisory in nature, informational in context, and are intended to assist employers in providing a safe and healthful workplace. So while they are not the gospel law, and they're not enforceable in terms of regulations or statutes, it does give employers a really good idea of the OSHA's perspective and what they might be thinking if they come to your place of business and inspect or investigate a complaint. Although the guidance from OSHA largely focuses on how to protect workers from COVID-19 in the workplace, it also addresses some key vaccination issues. According to the guidance, employers should continue to require vaccinated employees to wear masks and maintain social distance, provide information regarding the benefits and safety of vaccinations, and not distinguish between vaccinated and unvaccinated employees. And so again, that is consistent with what the EEOC is saying, not distinguishing between people who have chosen to have the vaccine and people who have chosen not to get the vaccine. It's also important that employers be familiar with the updated CDC guidance. There was guidance issued on March 5th of 2021, and it seems that each month or very frequently, we are getting additional guidance from the CDC about how to approach certain things. And so it's important to keep in mind that the CDC guidance, while informational and important, is not binding. And so we could not simply follow the CDC's guidelines blindly and defend the claim based on the CDC guidelines alone. The CDC guidance is far more direct in advocating for employers to provide any and all options for employees to obtain a vaccine. The CDC urges employers to work with their local health departments to set up on-site vaccination programs, and also recommends that employers provide information to employees on the benefits of vaccination. The guidance does, however, make clear that whether an employer may require or mandate COVID-19 vaccinations is a matter of state and other applicable law. The CDC guidance also cites the EEOC guidance and states that employees may qualify for exemptions from vaccination programs based on medical or religious grounds. Because the CDC does not have any responsibility for enforcing or administering employment laws, unlike OSHA and the EEOC, employers should not simply just do what the CDC says they should do, and you should consult legal counsel before you decide whether to have a mandatory program, whether to have a voluntary program, whether to adopt a policy at all, whether to offer an on-site clinic for vaccinations, and all those things that are surrounding the vaccination policy. I have a couple of, several additional frequently asked questions from employers that we're getting regularly that I think would be helpful to you as we navigate this issue. One of the questions being asked is, can employers encourage vaccinations through wellness programs incentives? And I do see here that we have someone from Johnson County Community College and noted yesterday on the news that they are incentivizing employees to receive a $250 payment for getting the vaccine if they show proof of the vaccine, or an ingenious idea, they can donate that $250 to scholarships for students. And so that is the type of incentive that some employers are considering in to encourage folks to have to get the vaccination. And so clearly you can incentivize. There are a lot of things you need to think about, and I'm sure the college was very thoughtful in how they planned it, how they rolled it out, because when an employer offers a wellness program incentive, federal law requires that the employer offer a reasonable alternative to employees who elect not to participate in the program due to a qualifying disability or sincerely held religious belief. We do not have clear guidance on what that alternative would be, but that's something that needs to be considered when the incentive is offered as part of your wellness program. Certain types of wellness programs can only offer de minimis incentives to employees because coercing employees into participation is prohibited by both the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. And if the wellness program is tied to the employer's group healthcare plan, more generous perks may be allowed. So it really is a careful consideration of how you're offering it in conjunction with what are you offering it. In addition, we need to consider that wellness incentives are often considered taxable income to employees, but the COVID-19 vaccine may qualify for an IRS exclusion as medical care. This really truly is a very complex area that requires careful consideration in light of the employer's unique circumstances and applicable law. So again, we encourage you to consult with your counsel before you roll out a vaccination program, incentive program. The next thing to consider is whether an employer can require an employee to sign a waiver of liability if the employee chooses not to get vaccinated and then contracts COVID-19 at work. Waivers typically are not recommended for employees because of workers' compensation obligations. And most likely in this context, they're probably not valid anyway, because you are required to provide employees with a safe work environment. In addition, or in lieu of this waiver of liability, we encourage employers to maybe have employees sign an acknowledgement of the risks of working without vaccination. That could be an effective alternative that you might be able to use if the employee files a workers' compensation claim or contracts COVID and then tries to make some other kind of claim against the company. The next question we get is, does an employer have to have a vaccination policy? And if so, does it have to be in the employee handbook? We recommend that you establish clear expectations with respect to the vaccine. Either it's voluntary and you encourage folks to get it, or it's required. And here are the procedures for providing notice to human resources that you have gotten the vaccine. If you do have an employee handbook, we typically recommend that all employment-related policies are included in the handbook or as an addendum acknowledged by the employee. Alternatively, you can issue the policy and have everyone sign it and keep the copy of that acknowledgement in the personnel file. The next question that we've received is, should job descriptions be updated to include vaccination as a requirement? Again, the EAU issue is what's causing employers not to jump into that mandatory policy. Once it's authorized, not emergency use authorized, but it's authorized for use outside of the emergency window, and it's widely available to anybody who wants to get it, then I think you can consider adding that as a requirement to your job description. But you also need to make sure that the requirement is job related and consistent with business necessity. For someone whose job duties involve working remotely, that they may not meet that criteria. It may not be job related and consistent with business necessity for that person to obtain the vaccine in order to work for you as an employer. We had an interesting question. I did a presentation on this in January, and I did have an interesting question that I thought I'd pass along here as well. If a position requires travel and an unvaccinated employee cannot meet airline requirements to show proof of vaccination, is that grounds for termination? I'm going to give my favorite lawyer answer to that question, and that is, it depends. What is the reason that the employee is not vaccinated? Is it because of a disability? Is it because of a sincerely held religious beliefs? That might be really tricky in terms of navigating that particular issue. What's the proximity of the destination? Are there reasonable alternative methods to get there? So if you've got somebody who is required to fly to Wichita from the Johnson County area, and they could drive to Wichita, and it's not that much longer to allow them to do that, then that might be a reasonable accommodation to allow them to drive in their own vehicle instead of take an airplane. Are there any accommodations that can be made to this employee who doesn't want to be vaccinated or can't be vaccinated because of a disability? And you may have obligations to transfer the employee to a vacant position for which they may be qualified. Or you are not required to remove the essential functions of the job from that employee. But it's not an automatic get out of jail free card. Oh, this person isn't vaccinated and they can't travel, and so therefore we get to fire them. That's not how that's going to work. Then another question is, can an employer require mask wearing in the workplace if CDC recommends that that continue until herd immunity is reached? Yes, you can require you can require employees to wear masks, and you could even require them to wear masks even if the CDC no longer says that they're necessary or required. And so, you know, as you have the right to manage mask wearing and social distancing in your workplace. And we recommend that at least we're following the CDC guidelines, just for purposes of demonstrating compliance with the safety recommendations when OSHA comes calling, or when the EEOC comes calling, or when you've got a workers' compensation claim. We can demonstrate, look, the CDC is one of the respected organizations that provides information to the public about how to navigate this pandemic. We've followed these recommendations to a T, and therefore we're providing a safe work environment. That will go a long way toward helping you defend any of those types of claims. Now that the vaccines are more widely available, most employers are not putting off developing plans and policies related to the impact on employees. And so employers really should have a clear stance on vaccinations and be prepared to respond to objections from employees who do not want to get vaccinated. Employers must also think about the overall health and safety of their workplace, which will now consist of many employees who are vaccinated, but others who are not. These issues are rapidly evolving, and it's important that you have the latest information and legal advice before you finalize your approach. I can take any questions that I might not have answered, or questions about the information, if anyone has them.
If you have any questions, you can type them into the chat.
Tammy, Carol Lehman with JCCC. Thank you for mentioning the new thing that just came out. I think the win-win for that is that those who chose to get the vaccination anyway, without that $250, have the ability to pay that good deed forward, and it will end up at the foundation helping a student either with a scholarship or with the meal share plan that we have to help those that are really having a rough time.
Yeah, I was excited to see that last night on the news, because I'm like, oh, this is great. I can mention that in my presentation, and then that you're here. I mean, how wonderful.
Well, thank you for mentioning it.
That was really interesting. And it's funny, you mentioned somewhere, is it even on there, the unvaccinated travel requests and how all that works out, because I just had that conversation this week on how is that going to work if once we get back to travel and if people don't want to be vaccinated, but they're required. So I thought that was interesting, and definitely I'm going to send this whole presentation over to that person that I talked with. So, you know, there's just so many nuances once you start kind of really digging into it. Like, frankly, I hadn't even thought about that, but I was kind of stumped. I'm like, yeah, what do you do? Because if that's your job to travel, and I know we haven't had to, but now you have to, and can you just self-select and not do that key part of your job, or put that on somebody else to do all the other travel? I don't know. It was just something that was one of those like, oh, very eye-opening. And there's so many of those little things I heard you mentioning that I'm like,
yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, honestly, there's no one size fits all approach for any of this. You know, you need to consider the employer's unique circumstances. You need to consider what, you know, the employee is required to do as part of their job. You know, we are not required to reassign the essential functions of someone's job to someone else, either as a, you know, for an accommodation for a disability even. And so those are just so fact-based that we encourage folks to check with a lawyer, to work through, you know, each step to get the big picture, and then advise about what the options are and the risks associated with those options. I'm not going to tell an employer what, you must do X, Y, or Z. I'll tell you, here are your options. Here's the least risky one, and here's the most risky one. And sometimes employers want to take the most risky one because of the situation that the employee is creating at work. And so it's worth it to take that action to make the workplace more calm or easier to navigate, or sometimes you need to make those risky decisions. But often employers want to take the least risky decision and just follow the law to a T and make sure that they're not having to face discrimination claims or retaliation claims and that sort of thing. And of course, we encourage compliance with the law when the law is clear. And in here, I don't know that we have the kind of clarity that we'd like to have, but as time passes, I think we will get some clarity, and hopefully it won't be with any of our clients or anyone on this presentation having to defend.
Well, I really appreciate you putting this together, and I think it's a lot of great information, and look forward to sharing that with all of our members. And certainly as questions come into us, we may kind of ping you once again and just follow up on some stuff. But appreciate your time and all of the great information. I thought it was wonderful, and everybody taking the time to listen today. And like I said, we'll share this on our social media and LinkedIn and through our our weekly emails and on our website. So we'll definitely be getting all that information out.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely.
Take care.
Thank you. Marlene, you want to wrap up with our upcoming events?
Tammy, can you make me the host again?
Oh, I don't know how to do that. Hang on one second. How would I do that? Is that at the top?
It's under participants. You should
Participants, I see it.
Be able to screen share. Yeah.
You might want to go
Tammy,
to
if you
the
just
upper
hit
right
stop
corner.
share.
Stop share.
Uh-huh.
I'm not seeing that opportunity for stop share. Where is that at?
At the very bottom of your screen, the green button, it should say stop share. Maybe it's at the top.
It's telling me I have a new share, but I don't have a stop share. I have a pause share. Maybe that's what I need to do. There we go. Is that better?
Nope.
Well,
let's see.
yeah, it's not giving me that option. Okay, who am I supposed to, it says give mouse keyboard control to. Who should I do that to?
To me,
Which one is me?
Marlene.
Sorry. But that's just not there. There's a stop share. Did I stop share now?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I'm sorry.
No. Do you want to just go through it verbally?
I don't have the okay. Sorry about that, guys. I will just go through our upcoming events. We do have a lunch focusing a conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion coming up on April 22nd. We are hosting that at the Civic Center, so it will be in person, and we are limiting the number of attendees to keep within the guidelines and make sure that we can keep just 2 people to a table and be safe that way. So if you are interested, the speakers are phenomenal. we really love to see you guys there. We also have our next AM Connect on April 21st. We're hosting those this month at Service Brewery. I was there yesterday. It was great. It was really, really great. And Courtney Service is going to be speaking. So if you've never heard her talk about her vision and her brewing techniques, whether you're a beer fan or not, she's fascinating to listen to. So I would encourage that. And then we do have a ribbon cutting coming up on the 29th. And that is with the Keller Williams Legacy Partners. So April's starting to get busy. We've had several events, and so that's fun to start to see a few people in person. So with that, I think that and I can't forget to mention that we do have our 75th anniversary. If you don't have your tickets for June 25th at Shawneetown 1929, make sure that you are getting those as well. So anyway, appreciate Tammy, your time, and everybody taking the time to attend, and just a final thank you to our sponsors, our Investor Guild sponsors, and wish you all a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.